but he shook hands with him and thanked him for his good opinion. "You want to serve," said his new friend. "You shall. You were made for it. You're one of us by nature. What'll you take to drink?" "Nothing just now," replied Joe, smiling faintly. "I haven't quite made up my mind." "A meddlesome fellow like you, and not made up his mind!" cried the sergeant. "Here, let me give the bell a pull, and you'll make up your mind in half a minute, I know." "You're right so far," answered Joe. "For if you pull the bell here, where I'm known, there'll be an end of my soldiering inclinations in no time. Look in my face. You see me, do you?" "I do," replied the sergeant with an oath. "And a finer young fellow, or one better qualified to serve his king and country, I never set my—" he used an adjective in this place—"eyes on." "Thank you," said Joe. "I didn't ask you for want of a compliment, but thank you all the same. Do I look like a sneaking fellow or a liar?" The sergeant rejoined with many choice asseverations that he didn't, and that if his, the sergeant's, own father were to say he did, he would run the old gentleman through the body cheerfully and consider it a meritorious action. Joe expressed his obligations and continued: "You can trust me, then, and credit what I say. I believe I shall enlist in your regiment to-night. The reason I don't do so now is, because I don't want until to-night to do what I can't recall. Where shall I find you this evening?" His friend replied with some unwillingness, and after much ineffectual entreaty, having for its object the immediate settlement of the business, that his quarters would be at the Crooked Billet in Tower Street, where he would be found waking until midnight and sleeping until breakfast time tomorrow. "And if I do come, which it's 1,000,000 to 1 I shall, when will you take me out of London?" demanded Joe. "Tomorrow morning at half after 8 o'clock," replied the sergeant. "You'll go abroad, a country where it's all sunshine and plunder, the finest climate in the world." "To go abroad," said Joe, shaking hands with him, "is the very thing I want. You may expect me." "You're the kind of lad for us," cried the sergeant, holding Joe's hand in his, in the excess of his admiration. "You're the boy to push your fortune. I don't say it because I bear you any envy, or would take away from the credit of the rise you'll make, but if I had been bred and taught like you I'd have been a colonel by this time." "Tush, man," said Joe. "I'm not so young as that. Needs must when the devil drives, and the devil that drives me is an empty pocket and an unhappy home. For the present, good-bye." "For king and country!" cried the sergeant, flourishing his cap. "For bread and meat!" cried Joe, snapping his fingers. And so they parted. He had very little money in his pocket, so little indeed that after paying for his breakfast, which he was too honest and perhaps too proud to score up to his father's charge, he had but a penny left. He had courage, notwithstanding, to resist all the affectionate importunities of the sergeant, who waylaid him at the door with many protestations of eternal friendship, and did in particular request that he would do him the favour to accept of only 1 shilling as a temporary accommodation. Rejecting his offers both of cash and credit, Joe walked away with stick and bundle as before, bent upon getting through the day as he best could, and going down to the locksmith's in the dusk of the evening. For it should go hard, he had resolved, but he would have a parting word with charming Dolly Varden. He went out by Islington and so on to Highgate, and sat on many stones and gates, but there were no voices in the bells to bid him turn. Since the time of noble Whittington, fair flower of merchants, bells have come to have less sympathy with humankind. They only ring for money and on state occasions. Wanderers have increased in number, ships leave the Thames for distant regions, carrying from stem to stern no other cargo. The bells are silent, they ring out no entreaties or regrets. They are used to it and have grown worldly. Joe bought a roll, and reduced his purse to the condition, with a difference, of that celebrated purse of Fortunatus, which, whatever were its favoured owner's necessities, had one unvarying amount in it. In these real times, when all the fairies are dead and buried, there are still a great many purses which possess that quality. The sum total they contain is expressed in arithmetic by a circle, and whether it be added to or multiplied by its own amount, the result of the problem is more easily stated than any known in figures. Evening drew on at last. With the desolate and solitary feeling of one who had no home or shelter, and was alone utterly in the world for the first time, he bent his steps towards the locksmith's house. He had delayed till now, knowing that Mrs. Varden sometimes went out alone, or with Miggs for her sole attendant, to lectures in the evening, and devoutly hoping that this might be one of her nights of moral culture. He had walked up and down before the house on the opposite side of the way 2 or 3 times, when, as he returned to it again, he caught a glimpse of a fluttering skirt at the door. It was Dolly's. To whom else could it belong? No dress but hers had such a flow as that. He plucked up his spirits and followed it into the workshop of the Golden Key. His darkening the door caused her to look round. Oh, that face! If it hadn't been for that, thought Joe, I should never have walked into poor Tom Cobb. She's 20 times handsomer than ever. She might marry a lord. He didn't say this, he only thought it. Perhaps looked it also. Dolly was glad to see him, and was so sorry her father and mother were away from home. Joe begged she wouldn't mention it on any account. Dolly hesitated to lead the way into the parlour, for there it was nearly dark. At the same time she hesitated to stand talking in the workshop, which was yet light and open to the street. They had got by some means, too, before the little forge, and Joe, having her hand in his, which he had no right to have, for Dolly only gave it him to shake. It was so like standing before some homely altar being married that it was the most embarrassing state of things in the world. "I have come," said Joe, "to say good-bye. To say good-bye for I don't know how many years, perhaps forever. I am going abroad." Now this was exactly what he should not have said. Here he was, talking like a gentleman at large who was free to come and go and roam about the world at pleasure, when that gallant coachmaker had vowed but the night before that Miss Varden held him bound in adamantine chains, and had positively stated in so many words that she was killing him by inches, and that in a fortnight more or thereabouts he expected to make a decent end and leave the business to his mother. Dolly released her hand and said, "Indeed." She remarked in the same breath that it was a fine night, and in short betrayed no more emotion than the forge itself. "I couldn't go," said Joe, "without coming to see you. I hadn't the heart to." Dolly was more sorry than she could tell that he should have taken so much trouble. It was such a long way, and he must have such a deal to do. And how was Mr. Willet, that dear old gentleman? "Is this all you say?" cried Joe. "All? Good gracious, what does a man expect?" She was obliged to take her apron in her hand and run her eyes along the hem from corner to corner to keep herself from laughing in his face. Not because his gaze confused her, not at all. Joe had small experience in love affairs, and had no notion how different young ladies are at different times. He had expected to take Dolly up again at the very point where he had left her after that delicious evening ride, and was no more prepared for such an alteration than to see the sun and moon change places. He had buoyed himself up all day with an indistinct idea that she would certainly say, "Don't go," or "Don't leave us," or "Why do you go?" or "Why do you leave us?" or would give him some little encouragement of that sort. He had even entertained the possibility of her bursting into tears, of her throwing herself into his arms, of her falling down in a fainting fit without previous word or sign. But any approach to such a line of conduct as this had been so far from his thoughts that he could only look at her in silent wonder. Dolly, in the meanwhile, turned to the corners of her apron and measured the sides and smoothed out the wrinkles, and was as silent as he. At last, after a long pause, Joe said good-bye. "Good-bye," said Dolly, with as pleasant a smile as if he were going into the next street and were coming back to supper. "Good-bye." "Come," said Joe, putting out both hands. "Dolly, dear Dolly, don't let us part like this. I love you dearly, with all my heart and soul, with as much truth and earnestness as ever man loved woman in this world, I do believe. I am a poor fellow, as you know, poorer now than ever, for I have fled from home, not being able to bear it any longer, and must fight my own way without help. You are beautiful, admired, are loved by everybody, are well off and happy, and may you ever be so. Heaven forbid I should ever make you otherwise, but give me a word of comfort. Say something kind to me. I have no right to expect it of you, I know, but I ask it because I love you, and shall treasure the slightest word from you all through my life. Dolly, dearest, have you nothing to say to me?" "No, nothing. Dolly was a coquette by nature, and a spoilt